December 16, 1944. The frost-covered Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Second Lieutenant Michael Harrison of the United States Army Air Forces shivered in the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt as he patrolled the skies at 20,000 feet. Intelligence had reported clear weather and minimal enemy activity, perfect conditions for a routine reconnaissance mission. Little did Harrison know that in less than 24 hours, his act of humanity would ripple across enemy lines in a way that military strategists could never have planned. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable account of how one pilot's decision to choose compassion over protocol would challenge the very foundations of what soldiers on both sides believed about their enemies, ultimately leading to an unprecedented moment when the machinery of war briefly paused in recognition of our shared humanity. The frigid winter air bit at Harrison's face where his oxygen mask didn't cover. His breath formed crystalline patterns on the inside of his canopy as he banked gently over the snow-dusted landscape below. The 24-year-old from Wilmington, Delaware, had been flying combat missions for 7 months now. His aircraft, lovingly nicknamed Clara Belle after his fiancée back home, had carried him through 23 successful sorties. Today marked his 24th mission, and he hoped it would be as uneventful as intelligence had promised. Bluebird 3, this is Eagle Nest. Report position and status, crackled the radio. Harrison adjusted his throat microphone. Eagle Nest, this is Bluebird 3. Currently at grid reference Baker 79er. Weather clear with excellent visibility. No activity to report. Over. Copy that, Bluebird 3. Continue patrol pattern Alpha and check in at 1500 hours out. As Harrison banked his aircraft to continue along his designated route, his thoughts drifted to home. Christmas was just 9 days away, and this would be his second consecutive holiday season far from family. In his breast pocket he carried Clara's latest letter, now worn at the creases from repeated readings. Her words sustained him through the long cold nights at the airfield, promises of a future together once this conflict was over. Meanwhile, 5 miles to the east, Hauptmann Werner Schröder of Jagdgeschwader 26 was experiencing engine trouble. His Messerschmitt 109 had developed an oil leak during a routine patrol, and the temperature gauge was climbing dangerously. At 31 years old, Schröder was considered a veteran among the increasingly younger pilots that made up the German Air Force by this late stage of the war. With 117 confirmed aerial victories, he was respected even among Allied pilots for his skill, and unusually, for his reputation for escorting damaged Allied bombers to the Channel rather than delivering a final blow to defenseless crews. Control, this is Volk Leader, Schröder radioed in German. Experiencing engine difficulties. Returning to base. Volk Leader, be advised, Allied aircraft reported in your sector. Exercise caution. Schröder acknowledged the warning and began a gentle descent. Hoping to nurse his ailing aircraft back to the airfield, the engine sputtered, sending vibrations through the airframe as white smoke began trailing behind him. These two men, Harrison and Schröder, from opposite sides of the conflict, were about to experience an encounter that would challenge everything they had been taught about warfare and the enemy. At 14:38 hours, Harrison spotted a thin trail of white smoke against the clear blue sky. Banking his P-47, he turned to investigate, maintaining proper distance in case it was an enemy trap. As he drew closer, he could make out the distinct silhouette of a Messerschmitt 109, its engine clearly malfunctioning as it lost altitude in a controlled but desperate glide. Military protocol was clear. This was an opportunity to claim an enemy aircraft. The German pilot appeared to be in trouble, making him vulnerable. Harrison's thumb hovered over the gun switch. One squeeze, and he could add another victory to his record, yet something made him hesitate. Through his canopy, Harrison could see the German pilot struggling with his aircraft, trying to maintain control as the engine continued to deteriorate. There was something in the man's determined effort that resonated with Harrison. He knew that in the same situation, he would be fighting just as hard to save his aircraft and his life. Making a decision that would later be scrutinized by military officials and celebrated by humanitarians, Harrison pulled his Thunderbolt alongside the struggling Messerschmitt, close enough to make eye contact with the German pilot, but far enough to avoid being perceived as a threat. Schroeder, expecting to be finished off at any moment, was startled to see the American aircraft pull alongside him. Through the canopy he could see the American pilot clearly. Instead of the expected hostility, the American gestured downward, then pointed ahead. Schroeder understood immediately. The American was indicating a small clearing about 2 miles ahead that might serve as an emergency landing site. With few options, and his engine now beginning to catch fire, Schroeder nodded in acknowledgement. The American pilot throttled back, allowing his aircraft to reduce speed to match the struggling Messerschmitt. Together, they descended toward the clearing, with Harrison occasionally gesturing course corrections to avoid terrain too steep for a safe landing approach. As they neared 1,000 feet, Schroeder's engine seized completely. Black smoke poured from the cowling as flames began to lick around the edges. With remarkable skill, he maintained a glide path toward the clearing, which now revealed itself to be a snow-covered farmer's field. Harrison watched from above as the Messerschmitt's wheels touched down, the aircraft bouncing once before settling into a slide across the snowy surface. But something was wrong. The German aircraft failed to decelerate as expected. It continued sliding toward a copse of trees at the field's edge. With a sickening crunch audible even to Harrison circling above, the aircraft collided with the tree line. Harrison had a choice to make. Military regulation prohibited landing in unsecured territory, especially to assist the enemy. But the smoke now billowing from the crash site suggested the German pilot might be in serious trouble. Circling once to examine the surroundings for any signs of enemy troops and finding none, Harrison made his decision. The P-47 touched down roughly on the uneven field, its large propeller throwing up clouds of snow as Harrison taxied as close as he dared to the crashed Messerschmitt. Cutting his engine, he unstrapped himself, pulled his sidearm as a precaution, and dropped from the wing into knee-deep snow. The German aircraft had crumpled against the trees, its nose crushed and cockpit partially caved in. Flames were beginning to spread from the engine compartment. Harrison trudged through the snow as quickly as possible, aware that the aircraft could explode at any moment. Reaching the wreckage, he found the canopy partially open but jammed. Inside, the German pilot was unconscious, blood streaming from a gash across his forehead. With no time to waste, Harrison holstered his sidearm and used both hands to wrench the canopy further open, the metal groaning in protest. The heat from the growing fire was intense, singeing his eyebrows and flight suit. With one final heave, the canopy gave way enough for him to reach inside. The German pilot was still strapped in, his body limp. Harrison cut through the harness with his pocket knife and with considerable effort pulled the unconscious man from the cockpit. Dragging him through the snow, Harrison managed to put about 100 yards between them and the aircraft before it erupted in a ball of flame, sending debris scattering across the pristine white field. Safe from the immediate danger of explosion, Harrison assessed the German's condition. The man was alive but unconscious, with a severe head wound and what appeared to be a broken leg, judging by its unnatural angle. Using his first aid kit, Harrison bandaged the head wound as best he could, and fashioned a splint for the leg using broken branches and strips torn from his emergency parachute. As he worked, the German began to regain consciousness, his eyes fluttering open to reveal a startling blue that contrasted sharply with the blood on his face. Seeing the American uniform, he stiffened, then winced in pain. "Easy," Harrison said in English, then remembered the German wouldn't understand. He pointed to himself. "American, doctor," he lied, hoping to convey that he was helping, not harming. The German's eyes showed confusion, then understanding. "Danke," he whispered before lapsing back into semi-consciousness. Harrison knew he needed to make a decision. Night would fall in a few hours, bringing freezing temperatures that neither of them would survive without shelter. His aircraft had a radio. He could call for extraction, but that would mean turning the German over as a prisoner of war. While that was the proper military protocol, something about the situation, the strange intimacy of saving a man he had been trained to kill, made him reluctant to make that call immediately. Looking around, he spotted a small stone structure at the edge of the field, perhaps a farmer's storage building. Supporting the injured German as best he could, Harrison began the arduous process of moving them both toward potential shelter. The stone building proved to be an abandoned shepherd's hut, long disused but with its roof and walls intact. Inside was dry if dusty, with an old straw mattress in one corner and a small fireplace. Harrison carefully laid the German pilot on the mattress and set about gathering materials for a fire. Using matches from his survival kit, he soon had a small blaze going in the fireplace, the warmth gradually filling the tiny space. As the German drifted in and out of consciousness, Harrison used the remaining daylight to return to his aircraft. He powered up the radio briefly, intending to report his position, but hesitated. The moment he reported in, he would be ordered to secure the German as a prisoner and await extraction. Something told him there was more to this situation, more that could be gained by treating this encounter differently. Making a decision that could potentially end his military career, Harrison sent only a brief message. Eagle Nest, this is Bluebird 3. Aircraft grounded due to mechanical issues. Will attempt repairs at first light. Position Baker 85. No assistance required at this time. Over. There was a pause before the reply came. Bluebird 3, confirm you do not require assistance. Weather reports indicate snowfall by midnight. Over. Confirmed, Eagle Nest. Have shelter and supplies. Will report at 0800 tomorrow. Out. Harrison powered down the radio and gathered his emergency kit, additional first aid supplies, and his rations. As an afterthought, he also grabbed the photograph of Clara that he kept taped to his instrument panel. Then, ensuring his aircraft was secured, he trudged back through the deepening twilight to the shepherd's hut. The German pilot was awake when he returned, sitting up slightly against the wall, his face pale but alert. His eyes tracked Harrison's movements as the American added more wood to the fire and organized his supplies. You. Help me. Why? The German asked in heavily accented English. Harrison was surprised. You speak English? A little. Studied. Before the war. At university. Harrison unwrapped a chocolate bar from his rations and broke it in half, offering a piece to the German. I'm Michael. Michael Harrison. The German accepted the chocolate with a nod of thanks. Werner Schroeder. He winced as he shifted position. Why did you not make me prisoner? It was a good question, one Harrison had been asking himself. I'm not sure, he answered honestly. It seemed wrong somehow. You weren't trying to fight me up there. You were just trying to get home, same as I would be. Schroeder studied him with intensity. They tell us Americans are, how do you say, gangsters, criminals. Harrison laughed despite himself. That's funny. They tell us you're all fanatical monsters. He gestured to the splintered leg. You don't seem very monstrous to me, just a pilot with bad luck. A ghost of a smile crossed Schroeder's face. Very bad luck. As the night deepened and snow began to fall outside, the two men cautiously began to talk. At first their conversation remained superficial. Flying experiences, aircraft preferences, weather conditions. But as the hours passed and the small fire crackled between them, their exchanges gradually became more personal. Harrison learned that Schroeder had been a mathematics professor before the war, drafted into service in 1939. He had a wife named Elsa and two young daughters he hadn't seen in nearly a year. He carried their photograph just as Harrison carried Clara's. In turn, Harrison shared stories of his home in Delaware, his plans to marry Clara and take over his father's hardware store after the war. He described Christmases with his large, boisterous family, and how much he missed his mother's apple pie. I have not had proper coffee in 2 years, Schroeder admitted at one point. We get ersatz coffee made from acorns. It is not good. Harrison reached into his pack and pulled out a small tin. Well, you're in luck. I can't offer you apple pie, but I do have real coffee. He held up the tin with a smile. Courtesy of the United States Army Air Forces. Using melted snow and his camp stove, Harrison brewed a small pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the tiny hut. As they sipped the hot drink from Harrison's canteen cup, passed back and forth between them, the strangeness of their situation seemed to crystallize. Two enemies sharing coffee in a shepherd's hut while war raged around them. My commander would have me court-martialed for this, Harrison said, not without humor. Mine would have me shot, Schroeder replied seriously, then added with the faintest smile, "But this coffee might be worth it." As midnight approached, Harrison checked Schroeder's wounds. The bleeding had stopped, but the leg needed proper medical attention. The German's face was drawn with pain despite his stoic demeanor. "I need to get you to medical care," Harrison said. "At first light, I'll radio my base." Schroeder nodded, understanding the implications. "I will become a prisoner." "Yes," Harrison admitted, "but you'll receive treatment, and the war can't last forever." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft pattering of snow against the hut's small window. "I have seen enough of war," Schroeder finally said, his voice quiet but firm. 2 years ago, I believed in what we were doing. Now," he trailed off, staring into the flames. "Now I only want to see my daughters grow up." Harrison pulled out his wallet and showed Schroeder the photograph of Clara. "That's why I want this all to end too. She's waited long enough." The German studied the picture, then carefully handed it back. "She is beautiful. You are fortunate." "I know it," Harrison agreed. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he asked the question that had been troubling him. "Werner, is it true what they say about the camps?" Schroeder's expression darkened and he looked away. "I have heard rumors, things that cannot be true, but—" He met Harrison's gaze directly. "I have seen trainloads of people. Where they go, no one tells us. But they do not come back." His voice dropped to a whisper. "This is not the Germany I knew." The weight of this confession hung heavily in the small space. Both men fell silent, contemplating realities too large and terrible to fully comprehend in their current circumstances. Eventually, exhaustion overcame them. Harrison took the first watch, insisting that Schroeder try to sleep despite his pain. Sitting by the fire, listening to the soft breathing of the man who hours ago had been his enemy, Harrison contemplated how quickly the certainties of war could dissolve when faced with individual humanity. The night passed slowly. Harrison dozed occasionally, always jerking awake to check on his unlikely companion and add wood to the fire. Toward dawn, he was startled fully awake by the sound of vehicles in the distance. Moving carefully to avoid waking Schroeder, he crept to the window and peered out through a gap in the shutters. In the grey pre-dawn light, he could make out 3 vehicles moving across the field toward his P-47. Even from a distance, their silhouettes were unmistakable, German military trucks. A patrol must have spotted the aircraft or the crashed Messerschmitt. Harrison's heart raced as he calculated their options. His own aircraft was too far to reach without being spotted. The trucks were between them and the nearest Allied lines. Schroeder was in no condition to move quickly. As he watched, soldiers spilled from the trucks, approaching his Thunderbolt with weapons raised. One of them, clearly an officer, directed the others to spread out and search the area. It wouldn't be long before they found the shepherd's hut. Harrison turned to wake Schroeder, but found the German already awake, watching him intently. "My people?" Schroeder asked, though it wasn't really a question. Harrison nodded. "About 20 of them, I'd guess. 3 trucks. They're checking out my aircraft now." Schroeder struggled to sit up straighter. "Help me up." "You can't walk on that leg," Harrison protested. "I do not intend to walk," Schroeder replied. "I intend to save your life as you saved mine." The German's plan was simple but audacious. Harrison would help him to the door of the hut. When the search party approached, Schroeder would call out to them, identifying himself and explaining that he had been injured in the crash of his aircraft. He would claim to have been found and assisted by local farmers who had fled when they heard vehicles approaching. "They will not look too closely at such a story," Schroeder explained. "They will be concerned with getting a decorated pilot back to medical care." "And what about me?" Harrison asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. "You will hide. There, in the root cellar." Schroeder pointed to a small trapdoor in the corner that Harrison hadn't noticed. "Once they take me away, you can return to your aircraft." "They'll have guards posted at my P-47, Harrison pointed out. Schroeder shook his head. "No, they will want to move quickly. The Americans have been conducting reconnaissance in this area for days. They will fear an airstrike or patrols. They will take me and go." Harrison wasn't convinced, but they had little choice. Already he could hear voices approaching the hut. Moving quickly, he helped Schroeder position himself near the door, then gathered his distinctive American gear and dropped it through the trapdoor into the small root cellar beneath the hut's dirt floor. As a final thought, he pressed his chocolate rations into Schroeder's hand. "For your daughters," he said simply. Schroeder nodded, his eyes conveying what words could not. "If I survive this war, I will find you, Michael Harrison of Wilmington, Delaware." "I'll hold you to that, Professor," Harrison replied, then descended into the root cellar, pulling the trapdoor closed above him. The space was cramped and smelled of old potatoes and damp earth. Through cracks in the floorboards, Harrison could see slivers of the room above and hear clearly when Schroeder called out in German as footsteps approached the hut. There was a commotion as the door was thrown open. Voices exclaimed in surprise, followed by rapid questions. Harrison could make out Schroeder's calm responses, though he couldn't understand the words. He heard the name Hauptmann Werner Schroeder spoken, followed by what sounded like exclamations of recognition and respect. More questions followed. Schroeder's responses were measured and confident. Several times Harrison heard him wince in pain, his explanations interrupted by what seemed to be medical assessment from one of the soldiers. There was mention of Bauern, farmers, which Harrison assumed was part of the cover story. After about 10 minutes, there was movement above. Multiple hands seemed to be helping Schroeder up. Boots scraped across the floorboards as they supported his weight. Harrison held his breath as one board directly above his head creaked under the pressure. "Warten Sie," Schroeder said. There was a pause. Then the sound of paper being unfolded. "Bitte eine Nachricht," Schroeder continued, "für die Bauerns, wenn sie zurückkommen." There was a brief discussion, then someone provided what sounded like a pencil. Harrison could hear the scratch of writing, then the paper being placed on what was probably the hut's single rough table. Then, with shuffling steps and the occasional grunt of pain, the group made their way out of the hut. The door closed and the voices receded. Harrison remained perfectly still, listening intently for any indication that someone might have stayed behind. Hearing nothing but the fading sound of the vehicles, he waited an additional 15 minutes before cautiously pushing open the trapdoor. The hut was empty. On the table lay a folded piece of paper. Opening it, Harrison found a message written in careful English. "Michael, they believe my story. I have told them American aircraft forced mine down and left. They will not search for you. Wait 2 hours, then go. My debt to you is paid, but my gratitude remains. Perhaps in a better world we could have been friends. Werner." Harrison refolded the note and tucked it into his breast pocket alongside Clara's letter. After gathering his remaining gear, he settled down to wait out the recommended 2 hours, stoking the fire one last time. As he waited, Harrison reflected on the extraordinary experience of the past 18 hours. He had been trained to see the enemy as a faceless, evil force, an ideology rather than individuals. Yet here he was, saved by the very man he had rescued, each of them recognizing the humanity in the other, despite the insignia on their uniforms. True to Schroeder's prediction, when Harrison eventually made his way back to his aircraft, he found it untouched and unguarded. The German patrol had indeed left the area completely, taking with them the wounded pilot who had inexplicably become his friend. The P-47's engine started without issue. There had never been any mechanical problems, of course. As Harrison prepared for takeoff, he spotted something tucked under the control yoke, a worn photograph of a smiling woman with 2 young girls. On the back, in the same neat handwriting as the note, were written coordinates and the words, "Our village, if you are ever nearby when this madness ends." Tucking the photograph alongside the note in his pocket, Harrison taxied across the now snow-covered field and took off, setting course for his base. He knew he would need to create a plausible story to explain his absence without revealing the truth of his encounter. As the Belgian countryside passed beneath him, he rehearsed a tale of mechanical difficulties and taking shelter from the snowstorm. What Harrison couldn't know, was that Werner Schroeder was at that very moment being transported to a field hospital 10 miles away, where he was already telling his own story to his commanding officer. But unlike Harrison, Schroeder was telling a version much closer to the truth, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences neither man could anticipate. as Schroeder described how an American pilot had saved his life rather than shooting him down, had tended his wounds and shared his rations. His commanding officer, Oberst Friedrich Müller, listened with increasing interest. Müller was no ardent supporter of the regime. He was an old-school military man who had become increasingly disturbed by what the conflict had become. In Schroeder's story, he recognized something valuable, a potential opening, a crack in the wall of hatred that had been carefully constructed between opposing forces. "You are certain this American deliberately chose to help you?" Müller asked, his weathered face thoughtful. "Without question," Schroeder affirmed from his hospital bed. "He could have shot me down. He could have left me to die in the wreckage. He could have taken me prisoner. Instead, he treated me as a fellow human being." Müller nodded slowly, then stood. "Rest now, Hauptmann. Your information is most interesting." As the senior officer left the room, Schroeder couldn't know that his story would soon travel up the chain of command, eventually reaching General Wilhelm Kreitz, commander of the German forces in that sector of the Ardennes. Kreitz, like Müller, was a career military officer with increasing misgivings about the direction of the conflict. More importantly, he was a man searching for a way to minimize the senseless loss of life in what he increasingly believed to be a lost cause. Meanwhile, Harrison landed at his base to a reception of relief and curiosity. His commanding officer, Colonel James Woodridge, accepted his explanation of mechanical troubles and taking shelter from the snow, though not without skepticism. "You're telling me you spent the night in some abandoned hut and fixed a mechanical issue that our ground crew can't even identify now?" Woodridge pressed. Harrison maintained his composure. "Yes, sir. Must have been a temporary issue with the fuel line. Worked itself out once the engine had time to cool down." Woodridge studied him for a long moment. "Well, you're back in one piece, which is what matters. Get some rest, Lieutenant. I want you back on patrol tomorrow." "Yes, sir," Harrison replied, saluting crisply. As he made his way to his quarters, Harrison was unaware that his encounter with Werner Schroeder was already setting in motion events that would challenge the very nature of how this sector of the front functioned. Both men had glimpsed something profound in their brief time together, the possibility that even in the darkest of circumstances, humanity could transcend the artificial boundaries of conflict. What happened next would prove that such moments of connection, far from being inconsequential, could send ripples through the rigid structures of warfare, creating spaces where compassion might briefly flourish amid the machinery of destruction. For as Harrison settled into his bunk that night, miles away, General Kreitz was issuing an unusual order, one that would manifest the very next morning in a way that would leave soldiers on both sides in stunned disbelief. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Ardennes on December 17th, 1944. The freshly fallen snow glittered in the early morning light, casting the war-torn landscape in deceptive tranquility. At the American Forward Operating Base near St. Vith, Second Lieutenant Michael Harrison was already preparing for his morning patrol, his mind still occupied by the extraordinary events of the previous day. As he completed his pre-flight checks, Colonel Woodridge approached, his expression unusually grave. "Harrison, there's been a change of plans. Intelligence reports unusual activity in Sector Baker 9. I want you to run a reconnaissance sweep, see what the Germans are up to." "Yes, sir," Harrison replied, securing his flight helmet. "Any specific information on what I'm looking for?" Woodridge frowned. "That's just it. We don't know. Radio intercepts indicate something unusual, but it doesn't match any known operational patterns. Could be troop movements, could be something else entirely. Keep your eyes open and your head down." With a salute, Harrison climbed into his P-47 and prepared for takeoff. As the powerful engine roared to life, he couldn't help but wonder if the strange activity had anything to do with Werner Schroeder. Had the German pilot been interrogated? Had he revealed the truth about their encounter? The questions gnawed at him as he guided his aircraft down the runway and into the clear morning sky. 15 miles to the east, Oberst Friedrich Müller stood in the command tent of the 14th Infantry Regiment, studying a map spread across a wooden table. Beside him, General Wilhelm Kreitz, commander of the regional forces, traced a line with his finger along a section of the front. "The orders have been transmitted to all unit commanders in the sector," Müller reported, though I must admit some expressed confusion. Kreitz's weathered face remained impassive. Confusion is preferable to blind obedience, Friedrich. Did any refuse? No, sir. The order came with your authority. They will comply, even if they do not understand. Good. Kreitz straightened, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the map. What about our guest? Hauptmann Schroeder is recovering well. The doctors say his leg will heal completely given time. Kreitz nodded thoughtfully. A fortunate man in more ways than one. Have the white flags been distributed? Yes, General, and the designated signalmen are in position. Then we proceed as planned. Kreitz checked his watch. 0800 hours. Let us see if this madness can be paused even briefly. As these preparations were underway, First Lieutenant Emma Randall of the United States Army Nurse Corps was overseeing the organization of medical supplies at a field hospital 3 miles behind American lines. At 29, Randall had seen more suffering in 2 years of war than most would witness in a lifetime. She had treated soldiers from both sides, watching too many die despite her best efforts. Captain Matthews wants 2 more units of plasma prepared for transport to the forward aid station, Sergeant Lewis informed her, clipboard in hand. Randall nodded, making a notation in her inventory log. Tell him they'll be ready in 20 minutes. Any word on casualty projections for today? Intelligence says it should be relatively quiet. Weather's keeping most air support grounded on both sides. Before Randall could respond, the distant sound of an explosion echoed across the snow-covered fields, followed by several more in rapid succession. So much for relatively quiet, Randall muttered, already moving toward the supply tent to prepare for incoming wounded. What neither Randall nor the American command yet realized was that the explosions were not artillery fire, but rather controlled detonations, German forces destroying their own defensive obstacles in several key locations along the front. High above the Ardennes, Michael Harrison banked his P-47 towards Sector Baker 9 as ordered. From his altitude of 15,000 feet, he had an excellent view of the snow-covered landscape below. As he approached the designated area, something unusual caught his eye. Movement along the German front lines, but not the typical patterns of troops repositioning or supply vehicles. Harrison dropped to 10,000 feet for a better look, maintaining a safe distance but close enough to observe. What he saw made him question his own eyes. Along a 3-mile stretch of the front, German soldiers were emerging from their trenches and fortifications, not in attack formation, but carrying what appeared to be white flags mounted on long poles. They were placing these flags at regular intervals along their lines, clearly visible against the snow-covered ground. Eagle Nest. This is Bluebird 3, Harrison radioed, his voice tight with confusion. I'm observing unusual activity in Sector Baker 9. German troops they appear to be placing white flags along their front positions. There was a long pause before the reply came. Bluebird 3, confirm your last. Did you say white flags? Affirmative, Eagle Nest. White flags at regular intervals. No aggressive movements visible. Request instructions. Stand by, Bluebird 3. As Harrison circled overhead, he observed more activity below. German officers were moving along their lines, speaking to their men. Through breaks in the clouds, he could see that American forward observers had also noticed the unusual activity. Field telephones would be buzzing all along the Allied command network by now. Meanwhile, at the field hospital, Emma Randall was surprised when the expected influx of wounded didn't materialize. Instead, a staff car arrived carrying Colonel Robert Turner, the division intelligence officer. Turner requested an immediate meeting with the hospital's commanding officer, Captain James Matthews. What's going on, sir? Randall asked Matthews when he emerged from the meeting looking perplexed. Matthews ran a hand through his thinning hair. Damnedest thing I've ever heard, Randall. The Germans have raised white flags all along a section of the front. No artillery fire, no small arms, nothing. They're just standing down. A trap. Intelligence doesn't think so. They've sent representatives forward under a flag of truce to find out what's happening. Randall's medical training had taught her to be suspicious of unexpected developments. Sir, should we prepare for mass casualties? This could be the prelude to something bigger. Matthews shook his head. Orders are to maintain regular readiness, not emergency protocols. For now, we wait and see. Back in the air, Harrison had been instructed to maintain his observation position while ground forces assessed the situation. As he circled, he noticed something even more extraordinary. German and American officers were meeting in the middle of no man's land, their breath visible as white plumes in the cold morning air as they spoke. Eagle Nest. Officers from both sides are conferring between the lines, he reported. No visible hostility. Request permission to continue observation. Granted. Bluebird 3. Maintain position and continue reporting. As Harrison watched from above, the meeting in no man's land concluded. The officers returned to their respective lines, and something remarkable began to unfold. The order to cease fire, already in effect along the German lines, was now apparently being implemented by American forces as well. The usual sporadic rifle fire and occasional artillery rounds that punctuated even the quietest days at the front had ceased completely. An eerie silence descended over the battlefield. In the German field hospital, Werner Schröder was being updated on these developments by Oberst Müller. Propped up in his bed, leg heavily bandaged, Schröder listened with growing amazement. Your encounter with the American pilot sparked something in General Kreitz, Müller explained. He has ordered a 24-hour humanitarian ceasefire along our sector. No firing unless fired upon. Schröder's blue eyes widened. And the Americans have agreed? Not officially, but they are respecting it so far. The general used your story, how an enemy chose humanity over duty, to convince the High Command that a brief pause would allow both sides to recover, wounded from no man's land, and perform essential maintenance without risk. That's remarkable, Schröder said softly, all from one small act. Müller's weathered face softened. Sometimes, Hauptmann, it is the small acts that remind us we are still human, even in this madness. He paused, then added more formally, You should know that your actions will be reported to Berlin. Helping the enemy, even one who saved your life, could be viewed unfavorably. Schröder met his superior's gaze steadily. I understand, sir. Müller nodded once. I thought you might. Rest now. You'll need your strength for whatever comes next. As Müller departed, Schröder reflected on how his life had changed in just 24 hours. His decision to help Harrison escape rather than turning him in had been instinctive, born of the same humanity the American had shown him. Now somehow, that single interaction had cascaded into something much larger, a temporary island of peace in an ocean of conflict. By mid-morning, word of the spontaneous ceasefire had spread throughout the units on both sides of the line. At first, soldiers remained cautious, keeping to their trenches and foxholes, skeptical of the enemy's intentions, but as the hours passed with no hostile action, a tentative curiosity began to emerge. In a forward American position, Sergeant David Klein of the 28th Infantry Division observed the German lines through binoculars. I still don't trust it, he muttered to Corporal Thomas Jenkins beside him. Has to be some kind of trick. Jenkins, a 20-year-old from Missouri, shrugged. Maybe they're just as cold and tired as we are. Klein lowered his binoculars with a skeptical frown. Germans don't get tired, they're machines. That's not what my cousin said. He processed some prisoners last month. Said they looked half-starved, some of them just teenagers. Before Klein could respond, their conversation was interrupted by their lieutenant. Klein, Jenkins, command wants a detail to help recover bodies from no man's land. The Germans have proposed a joint recovery effort. Any volunteers? Klein and Jenkins exchanged glances of disbelief. After a moment, Jenkins stepped forward. I'll go, sir. Klein hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Me too. 20 minutes later, Klein and Jenkins, along with 4 other American soldiers, advanced cautiously into no man's land under a white flag. From the German side, a similar group approached. The two teams met in the middle, amid the shell craters and tangled barbed wire that characterized the contested ground between the lines. A German officer stepped forward. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann, he introduced himself in accented English. We have identified 7 bodies in this section, 4 German, 3 American. The American lieutenant nodded. Lieutenant Peter Walsh, we've counted the same. There was an awkward pause as the two groups regarded each other warily. These were men who, just hours before, would have shot at each other without hesitation. Now they stood face to face, tasked with a shared humanitarian mission. We will help with your men if you will help with ours, Hoffmann proposed. Walsh considered this, then nodded. Agreed. And so began one of the more surreal episodes of the war. German and American soldiers, working side by side, gently recovered the bodies of fallen comrades, both their own and their enemies. They spoke little, communicating mostly through gestures, but the shared task created a temporary bond that transcended the barriers of language and allegiance. As Klein and a German corporal carefully placed an American body onto a stretcher, the German unexpectedly spoke. "He has a letter," the corporal said, pointing to a blood-stained envelope protruding from the dead soldier's pocket. "For family, yes." Klein nodded and carefully removed the letter, tucking it into his own pocket to be sent home with the soldier's personal effects. "Danke," he said, using one of the few German words he knew. The corporal nodded solemnly. "Bitte." Above them, Michael Harrison continued his aerial observation, reporting the joint recovery operation to headquarters. As the morning progressed, he noticed something even more unexpected. Small groups of soldiers from both sides were beginning to gather in no man's land, not just for body recovery, but apparently engaging in cautious conversation. "Eagle Nest, you're not going to believe this," Harrison radioed. "Troops from both sides are now mingling in no man's land, no signs of hostility. It appears to be fraternization." "Say again, Bluebird 3, came the incredulous response. "Fraternization, sir. They're talking to each other." There was a long pause before headquarters replied, "Continue observation, Bluebird 3. Command is assessing the situation." What Harrison was witnessing was indeed extraordinary. After completing the solemn task of recovering their dead, small groups of soldiers had lingered in no man's land, their shared work having broken down some of the psychological barriers between them. A German soldier offered an American a cigarette, an American shared a chocolate bar. Simple gestures that, in any other context, would have been unremarkable, but here between enemies took on profound significance. Lieutenant Walsh observed this developing phenomenon with a mixture of concern and fascination. Military regulations strictly prohibited fraternization with the enemy, yet there was something deeply human happening here that he was reluctant to disrupt. As long as his men remained alert and kept their weapons ready, perhaps this brief, strange interlude could be permitted. By noon, the unusual ceasefire had come to the attention of higher command on both sides. At American Divisional Headquarters, Major General Norman Cota was being briefed on the situation. "You're telling me our boys are out there sharing cigarettes with Germans?" Cota asked incredulously. "Yes, sir," the intelligence officer confirmed. "It appears to be a spontaneous development following the joint body recovery operation." Cota paced the room, his face a study in conflicted emotions. "Any indication this is some kind of German psychological operation?" "None that we can detect, sir. German command seems as surprised as we are. Their initial white flag was apparently authorized by a General Kreitz for humanitarian purposes. But the fraternization appears unplanned." Cota stopped pacing and stared at the map on the wall. "How wide is the affected area?" "Approximately 3 miles of front, centered on grid reference Baker 9. After a long moment of contemplation, Cota made his decision. "Issue the following order. The unofficial ceasefire will be tolerated until 1600 hours today for humanitarian purposes only. All unit commanders are to ensure their men remain vigilant and prepared to resume hostilities immediately if required. No strategic information is to be shared, and all interactions with enemy personnel are to remain within sight of our lines." "Yes, sir." As the order was transmitted down the chain of command, a similar decision was being made by General Kreitz on the German side, extending his original ceasefire order, but adding similar cautions and limitations. In no man's land, the tentative interactions between opposing forces continued to evolve. What had begun as silent cooperation in a grim task had developed into small clusters of conversation. Language barriers were overcome through gestures, simple phrases, and the occasional soldier with enough knowledge of the other's language to serve as a rudimentary translator. Sergeant Klein found himself in one such group, sharing K-rations with 3 German soldiers, while Jenkins attempted to communicate using high school German and elaborate hand gestures. One of the Germans, a weathered man in his 30s, produced a dog-eared photograph of a woman and 2 children. "Family," he said simply, pointing to the image. Klein nodded and retrieved his own well-worn photograph of a young woman. "Meine Frau," he said, using one of the phrases Jenkins had taught him. "My wife." The German nodded appreciatively. "Schön," he said. "Beautiful." "Yeah," Klein agreed. "Schön." This simple exchange, 2 enemies sharing glimpses of the lives they hoped to return to, was repeated dozens of times across no man's land that December day. Photographs of loved ones were displayed, hometown names exchanged, simple gifts like cigarettes or chocolate shared. For a few hours the machinery of war paused, allowing the men caught in its gears to recognize each other's humanity. At the field hospital, Emma Randall was experiencing the effects of the ceasefire in a different way. The day that had begun with expectations of casualties had instead brought a welcome lull. Taking advantage of the unexpected respite, she had ordered a thorough inventory and reorganization of their medical supplies. "Lieutenant Randall," called a corpsman from the entrance of the supply tent, "there's someone here to see you." Randall looked up from her inventory sheets to see a German medical officer being escorted by 2 American MPs. She recognized him immediately, Dr. Stefan Brandt, a surgeon she had briefly worked alongside during a similar unofficial truce 6 months earlier, when their respective field hospitals had both treated casualties from a collapsed mine that had trapped soldiers from both sides. "Dr. Brandt," she greeted him, setting aside her clipboard, "this is unexpected." Brandt, a slim man with prematurely grey hair, offered a tired smile. "Lieutenant Randall, I heard your unit was stationed in this sector now. I have come with a request, sanctioned by your command under today's unusual circumstances." The MPs remained at a respectful distance as Brandt explained his purpose. The German field hospital was critically short of several essential medications: sulfanilamide for infection, morphine for pain management, and plasma for transfusions. He proposed a trade, detailed medical intelligence about a new treatment protocol for trench foot that German doctors had developed, in exchange for a small quantity of the needed supplies. "I understand if you must refuse," Brandt concluded, "but I thought given today's spirit of cooperation—" Randall considered carefully. The medications were precious, but they had recently received a substantial resupply. The trench foot information could potentially save American soldiers from debilitating injury. More importantly, medicine was supposed to transcend the boundaries of conflict, a principle both she and Brandt had been trained to uphold. "I'll need to consult with Captain Matthews," she said finally. "But speaking personally, Doctor, I believe we can help each other." Within the hour, with Matthews' approval and under the watchful eyes of the MPs, the exchange was completed. Brandt provided detailed documentation on the German treatment protocol, while Randall assembled a modest but meaningful quantity of the requested medications. As they concluded their transaction, Brandt hesitated, then spoke quietly. "When this is over, Lieutenant, perhaps medical professionals from both sides can share what we've learned without requiring a war to bring us together." Randall nodded. "I'd like that, Doctor. Good luck with your patients." "And you with yours." As Brandt was escorted back toward the front lines, Randall reflected that the day's extraordinary events had created space for something rare and valuable, cooperation that might save lives on both sides. Like the soldiers sharing photographs in no man's land, she and Brandt had briefly transcended their assigned roles as enemies to reconnect with their shared identity as healers. By mid-afternoon, news of the spontaneous ceasefire had reached even higher levels of command. At the headquarters of the American 12th Army Group, General Omar Bradley was receiving a full briefing on the situation. "And you're certain this isn't preceding a major German offensive?" Bradley questioned his intelligence officer. "As certain as we can be, sir. All indicators suggest this is an isolated event, limited to a small section of the front under the command of this German General Kreitz. Our sources suggest he's an old-school professional soldier, not particularly aligned with extremist ideology." Bradley studied the map thoughtfully. "What about our men? Any concerns about morale or combat readiness?" "On the contrary, sir. Field reports indicate the brief respite is being used constructively. Equipment maintenance, improved fortifications, rest for exhausted units. Unit commanders report their men understand this is temporary and remain vigilant. After considering all the information, Bradley made his decision. I won't countermand the local arrangement as long as it remains contained and concludes as scheduled. Sometimes a breath of humanity amidst all this can remind our men what they're fighting for. He fixed his intelligence officer with a stern look. But I want hourly updates, and any sign of German exploitation is to be reported immediately. Yes, sir. High above the Ardennes, Michael Harrison was being relieved by another reconnaissance pilot. After nearly 6 hours of continuous observation, his fuel was running low and fatigue was setting in. Bluebird 3, you are clear to return to base, came the radio message. Bluebird 7 will take over observation duties. Copy that, Eagle Nest, returning to base. As Harrison banked his aircraft for the return journey, he took a final look at the remarkable scene below. What had begun with white flags was now a genuine, if temporary, island of peace. From his altitude, he could see the small clusters of soldiers in no man's land, Americans and Germans alike, engaging in what appeared to be the simple human activity of connection, sharing, talking, briefly setting aside the machinery of war to which they had been yoked. Harrison couldn't help but wonder if Werner Schroeder had somehow influenced these events. Had his story, their story, travelled up the German chain of command? Had their small moment of shared humanity somehow catalyzed this larger expression of the same principle? He would probably never know for certain, but the possibility filled him with a sense of purpose beyond anything he had experienced in his military service. Landing at his base, Harrison was immediately summoned to Colonel Woodridge's office. The colonel was waiting behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "Sit down, Harrison," Woodridge ordered, gesturing to the chair across from him. As Harrison complied, the colonel studied him intently. "You spent more time observing the situation than any other pilot. I want your assessment." Harrison chose his words carefully. "Sir, in my opinion, the ceasefire appears genuine. I observed no evidence of German troops using it as cover for strategic repositioning or other military advantage. The fraternization, while technically against regulations, seemed to enhance rather than diminish our troops' morale." Woodridge nodded slowly. "That aligns with ground reports." He leaned forward. "Now, off the record, Lieutenant. You were in that same sector yesterday when you reported mechanical troubles. Did you observe anything then that might relate to today's events?" Harrison felt his heart rate increase, but kept his expression neutral. "Nothing specific, sir. The area seemed quiet yesterday as well." Woodridge held his gaze for a long moment, then leaned back. "Very well. You're dismissed. Get some rest. You'll be back on patrol at 0600 tomorrow." "Yes, sir." Harrison saluted and turned to leave. "Harrison," Woodridge called as he reached the door. "Whatever happened out there, yesterday or today, I think we can agree that sometimes the right thing and the regulation thing aren't always the same. That will be all, Lieutenant." Harrison nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "Thank you, sir." As the afternoon progressed toward the designated end of the ceasefire at 1600 hours, the mood in no man's land gradually shifted. The soldiers who had briefly set aside their roles as enemies began preparing to resume them. Handshakes were exchanged, final cigarettes shared, and small tokens, insignia, buttons, personal items of little value but immense symbolic significance, traded as mementos of this extraordinary interlude. Sergeant Klein, who had begun the day skeptical of the entire enterprise, found himself reluctant for it to end. The Germans he had spent hours with no longer seemed like the faceless, inhuman enemy of propaganda. They were men like himself, tired, cold, longing for home, doing their duty as they understood it. "Time to wrap it up," Lieutenant Walsh announced, moving through the American groups. "Everyone back to our lines in 5 minutes." As the soldiers began to disperse, the German with whom Klein had shared photographs approached him one last time. He held out his hand, offering a worn brass button from his uniform. "Zum Erinnern," he said. "To remember." Klein accepted the button and, after a moment's consideration, removed his unit patch from his sleeve. "Same to you," he said, pressing it into the German's hand. The two men clasped hands briefly, then turned and walked in opposite directions, back to their respective armies, their respective duties, their respective sides of a conflict that would continue despite this brief moment of connection. By 1615 hours, no man's land was empty once again. Soldiers on both sides had returned to their trenches and fortifications. The white flags had been removed from the German lines. Rifles that had been temporarily set aside were now held at the ready. The machinery of war had been restarted, and yet something had changed. Men who had spent months dehumanizing the enemy as a psychological defense mechanism now carried memories of faces, names, photographs of families. The abstract concept of the enemy had been complicated by the concrete reality of individual humans with hopes, fears, and loves not unlike their own. At the German field hospital, Werner Schröder received a visit from General Kreitz himself. The general, a tall man with iron-grey hair and penetrating eyes, pulled up a chair beside Schröder's bed. "Your American pilot made quite an impression, Hauptmann," Kreitz said without preamble. Schröder blinked in surprise. "Sir?" "Your encounter. One enemy treating another as a human being rather than a target. It prompted me to consider what else might be possible, even within the constraints of our duty." Kreitz studied Schröder thoughtfully. "The 24-hour ceasefire I ordered was officially for the recovery of bodies and essential maintenance. Unofficially, it was an experiment." "What kind of experiment, sir?" Schröder asked. "To see if ordinary soldiers, given the opportunity, would choose humanity over hatred." A small smile softened the general's stern features. "They did not disappoint me." Schröder absorbed this information with growing amazement. "Then today's events were set in motion by your Americans' decision to save you rather than shoot you down," Kreitz confirmed, "and by your decision to tell the truth about it." The general stood, straightening his uniform. "Small acts of courage and humanity, Hauptmann. They may not end this war, but perhaps they can remind us all of what must be rebuilt when it is over." With a formal nod, Kreitz departed, leaving Schröder to contemplate the extraordinary ripple effect of his encounter with Michael Harrison. One life saved had led to a day of peace that had touched hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives on both sides. It was a small victory for humanity, in a conflict that had seen too few such moments. That evening, as darkness settled over the Ardennes, the sounds of war gradually resumed. Sporadic rifle fire, the occasional thump of a mortar, the distant rumble of vehicles moving under cover of night. The ceasefire was over. The brief interlude of peace concluded. Yet in trenches and foxholes along that 3-mile stretch of front, men on both sides carried something new with them into the darkness. Memories of connection that complicated the narrative of animosity, small tokens exchanged that humanized the abstract enemy, stories that would be told and retold long after the war had ended. At his base, Michael Harrison sat on his bunk, writing a letter to Clara by the light of a single lamp. He described the beauty of the Belgian countryside, the camaraderie of his fellow pilots, the hope he maintained for their future together, all the safe topics permitted by military censors. What he couldn't write, about Werner Schröder, about the extraordinary day that had followed their encounter, he committed to memory, a story to be shared with her in person when he returned home. As he wrote, Harrison's hand occasionally strayed to his breast pocket, where he kept Schröder's photograph of his family and the note with coordinates to his village. When the war ended, if they both survived, he intended to fulfill the unspoken promise of those items. Enemies by circumstance, they had discovered themselves to be potential friends by choice. That connection, Harrison believed, was worth preserving beyond the artificial boundaries of conflict. What none of the participants in that day's events could know was how their story would resonate beyond the immediate moment. In the days that followed, accounts of the spontaneous ceasefire spread through units on both sides. Some dismissed it as foolish sentimentality, others treasured it as evidence that humanity could persist even in war's darkest hours. More significantly, the commanders who had permitted the ceasefire, General Kreitz on the German side and General Cotter on the American, found themselves quietly implementing additional humanitarian measures where military necessity allowed. Medical supply exchanges became more common. Recovery of wounded from no man's land was facilitated without formal truces. Small courtesies, warning shots before artillery barrages to allow troops to take cover, restraint when enemy medical personnel were visible, became more frequent in that sector. None of this changed the course of the war. The conflict continued with all its terrible cost in lives and suffering. But along that small stretch of the front, the machinery of destruction operated with a slightly lighter touch, tempered by the shared memory of a day when enemies had looked into each other's eyes and recognized their common humanity. When the war finally ended in 1945, Michael Harrison returned to Wilmington, Delaware. He married Clara, took over his father's hardware store, and began building the life they had planned together. But the memory of Werner Schroeder and their extraordinary encounter remained with him, a private story he wasn't yet ready to share with anyone, even Clara. It wasn't until 1956, 11 years after the war's end, that Harrison finally decided to act on the coordinates Schroeder had given him. With Clara's blessing, he traveled to Germany, now rebuilding itself from the devastation of conflict. The village, when he found it, was small but tidy, showing signs of recent reconstruction. At the village center, Harrison inquired after the Schroeder family, his German halting but comprehensible. An older woman pointed him toward a modest house at the edge of the village. As Harrison approached, he saw a man working in the garden, older now, with streaks of gray in his once blonde hair, but unmistakably Werner Schroeder. One leg was noticeably stiffer than the other as he moved between the rows of vegetables. Harrison paused at the garden gate, suddenly uncertain. Would Schroeder remember him? Would he be welcome? Or would the German man prefer to leave memories of the war firmly in the past? Before he could decide, Schroeder looked up. For a moment he stared in confusion, then his eyes widened in recognition. He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Michael Harrison of Wilmington, Delaware," Schroeder said. His English much improved since their last meeting. "You took your time." Harrison smiled back. "I had a promise to keep, Professor." The two men regarded each other across the gate, former enemies, reluctant comrades, potential friends. Then Schroeder stepped forward and opened the gate. "Elsa has just made coffee," he said simply. "Real coffee, not the acorn kind. And I believe you should meet my daughters, who are no longer so little. They have heard your story many times." As Harrison stepped through the gate, he felt the weight of history, both surrounding and connecting them. What had begun as a single act of compassion in the snow-covered fields of Belgium had rippled outward in ways neither of them could have anticipated, eventually bringing them full circle to this quiet garden in a recovering Germany. "I'd like that very much," Harrison replied, following Schroeder toward the house. Behind them, the garden gate swung closed, marking the completion of a journey that had begun 12 years earlier, when an American pilot had chosen to save a wounded enemy rather than adding another victory to his record. In that moment of choice, something profound had been recognized, that even in war's darkest hour, humanity can assert itself through individual acts of compassion, creating ripples of connection that transcend the artificial boundaries of conflict. In the years that followed, Harrison and Schroeder maintained their unlikely friendship through letters, occasional visits, and eventually phone calls. Their families grew close despite the distance, their children and grandchildren continuing the connection that had begun so improbably in the midst of war. The story of their encounter and the day that followed, when the German army lowered their guns in a spontaneous expression of shared humanity, became a treasured family legend, passed down through generations as evidence that even in humanity's darkest chapters, light can persist through the simplest acts of compassion. In 1984, 40 years after their first meeting, Michael Harrison and Werner Schroeder stood together at a small private ceremony near Saint-Vith, Belgium. Local officials had agreed to place a modest marker commemorating the spontaneous ceasefire of December 17, 1944. The plaque bore no names, only a simple inscription. "On this ground, for one day, enemies became humans in each other's eyes. May we learn to see each other so clearly without requiring the context of war." As the two elderly men stood before the marker, their families gathered around them. Schroeder leaned close to Harrison and spoke quietly. "One small act, my friend. Who could have known how far it would reach?" Harrison nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon where the Ardennes forest met the sky. "I think perhaps that is always the way of it." We never know how far the ripples will travel when we cast that first stone of kindness into dark waters. Together, former enemies turned lifelong friends. They placed a single white flag beside the marker, not in surrender, but in celebration of the humanity that had prevailed, if only briefly, over the machinery of conflict. A small gesture to commemorate a larger truth, that compassion, even in war's darkest hours, is never wasted, its effects rippling outward in ways we may never fully comprehend. Their story, of an American pilot who saved a wounded enemy, and the extraordinary day that followed when the German army lowered their guns, remains a testament to the power of individual choice in the face of systemic violence. It reminds us that even within the rigid structures of warfare, moments of authentic human connection can create spaces where peace, however temporary, might flourish. For Harrison and Schroeder, what began as a chance encounter between enemies became the foundation of a friendship that spanned decades, transcending the artificial boundaries that had once divided them. Their lives, forever altered by that moment of compassion in the snow, serve as evidence that humanity can persist even in our darkest chapters, waiting only for the courage of individuals to give it voice and form. In the end, their story is not merely about war, but about the enduring capacity of human beings to recognize themselves in one another, even across the lines that power and politics draw between us. It is about the quiet heroism of choosing compassion when protocol demands indifference, of seeing the human behind the uniform, the person beyond the designation of enemy. It is, in its essence, a reminder that the most profound revolutions begin not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of humanity. One person choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier, one heart recognizing another across the artificial chasms that separate us, one small moment of grace amid the machinery of destruction. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.